everyone, I'm Nicole Atala, and welcome to Clocking In, Labor and Employment News for Government Contractors. I am a partner here at PilieroMazza, and I am here with my special guest, Mark Rosenau. He is counsel with us, and today we are going to be talking in our very short time together about the Davis-Bacon Act. The Davis-Bacon Act has been a hot topic lately because of the new regulations that were issued by the Department of Labor that go into effect in just a couple short weeks, I believe on October 23rd. But instead of talking about what they do include, we're going to talk about something that they don't include, which I think is just as important as what it did include. If you are really aching to know what is in there, it is like 1,000-something pages of regulations, but Sarah Nash and I did a webinar a few short weeks ago. Go check it out if you are interested in what the regulations did include. But one thing that they did not include was they did not address anything about classification. And classification is one of the biggest challenges that construction contractors have with the Davis-Bacon Act because it is a very complicated thing, right? And you not only have to look at the wage determination to figure out if something fits, but you have to deal with things like what if a classification doesn't fit? And if there's a union locality practice, you're kind of expected to know it. So today we wanted to talk about some of the challenges that were inherent in classification from an investigation perspective and from a, just practical, how do you get out in front of this classification issue? So Mark, tell us a little bit, like in 10 seconds about your practice, what you do, and why from your perspective, from a litigation perspective, the classification issue has been so important.
Certainly, and thanks for having me on here. Obviously, the goal when we're dealing with things like contracts under the Davis-Bacon Act is to not have anyone in my practice group ever involved in the process. We would love for there to be a meeting of the minds, a well-negotiated agreement with the government, and no challenges raised. However, and unfortunately, sometimes there is a difference of opinion about how to interpret what the agreement calls for. And it's that classification question that we see coming up time and again. So the first thing I would say is congratulations to everybody who's watching. You've taken the first step, which is to identify that there's an issue. And then the second step would be, what can we do to mitigate risk? Well, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today.
And so one of the challenges that contractors have that at least we've seen on the labor and employment side of the house is that you think there's an easy classification to be made, right? You're talking about trades, skilled laborers, unskilled laborers. It seems very easy. But if you look on wage determinations, there's this union locality indicator on there. And it tells you some information. It tells you that the wage determination is based on this locality practice. So they took the wages or they took the prevailing wage rates largely from one particular union or a number of unions where they average. That's one of the things that is changing in the regulations, how they make those calculations. But it tells you that that locality practice is what's prevailing. And so a contractor, a construction contractor that's bidding on that thing has to know not only what rates are paid, but what the practice is. And sometimes I have clients that say, well, what the heck is a union locality practice? Well, it can be things like how many hours. If a carpenter works 1 hour in a day, they have to be paid 8 hours in a day. Those are the types of union locality practices that you are supposed to know. And Mark, how would you do that? Do you have any idea of how you do that? And maybe it's rhetorical because it's really hard.
Well, it's an incredible challenge, particularly if you're not using union labor to try and access that information, right? So I think the best thing that we can advise, and we have confronted this already in some of the practice that we have here at PilieroMazza, but the best thing that we can advise is surfacing these questions and these concerns early on with the government contracting official that you're engaged with. And when you're having that negotiation in early days, this is what we interpret the contract to mean as applied to this classification. This is how we're interpreting what this calls for. And those kinds of ambiguities, especially since you know where you're building and you know where the contract is actually being executed, those ambiguities can be surfaced, not perfectly and not every T crossed, every lowercase j and I dotted, but you can surface a lot of these concerns if you identify early on where the standards are changing and where the attention is going to be in the future if there is a disagreement about interpretation.
Right. Sometimes we can get an opinion from someone at the Department of Labor. Sometimes clients will call and we'll say, yeah, we can make a call to the union listed and see if they have a practice. Sometimes we disagree with whether that union locality practice is actually applicable under the Davis-Bacon Act. And every now and then we have those types of cases and there's just a bona fide disagreement with the Department of Labor over whether a certain practice applies. And that's often when we get into kind of this litigation disposition. We've gone through an investigatory process. We haven't been able to resolve it or settle it with the Department of Labor. And so then we start moving through this litigation process. From a high level, Mark, what's the difference between your regular civil litigation and this administrative type of litigation with the Department of Labor?
From a high level, the lived experience for the client is the same. It's expensive, it's uncertain, and it detracts from the business goals that you have. That's why you're running the company. It's not to defend any earlier decisions you made under a contract where the Davis-Bacon Act applies or whatever else applies. The goal is to build, is to generate wealth, is to do those kinds of things. It's not to get billed by attorneys like myself. So from a high level, the lived experience is not a lot different, even though you're operating under the Code of Federal Regulations versus the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure generally. There is an interplay between those two things, but that would be us going to the low level, not keeping it at the high level.
Right. Yeah, it's unpleasant, but sometimes the stakes are high enough, and we would, advise clients. The Department of Labor is not dropping, for example, suspension and debarment. It might be worth litigating, right? It might be worth litigating something if it's in your entire business structure and it's going to affect your entire business plan and how you operate. It might be worth litigating, but the Department of Labor does have this overarching big stick, which is suspension and debarment, and it's a high risk proposition. And again, if you're looking for what is in the new regulation, that's one of those things to look for, is the standard for suspension and debarment for Davis-Bacon related acts is adjusting, something that you might want to know. This also becomes kind of more important now that we have wage determinations that are self-executing. So all of the issues that we had before that are not addressed by the new regulations are still out there. They're just amplified in certain ways by aspects of the regulations that are being changed. So this classification issue, in light of what is changing in the regulation, becomes more amplified. Mark, any last thoughts that you want to leave folks with today?
Sure. One of the things that, as a litigator and a person who focuses on these adversarial proceedings like trials or hearings, always wants to say to people who are brave enough to come forward and to look for this advice, hopefully before you're downstream, is it shouldn't occupy all of your mind and all of your attention. You should generally be thinking, as you're navigating different items that could produce conflict between you and somebody you're contracting with or with the United States government, you should be thinking about, how does this look in the light of day? How might this read? This email, for instance, it might ultimately be discussed, or how might this decision to either inquire, as Nicole had outlined, with the union representative or with the contracting officer or the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division, or whoever else, or to not seek that information. You're always making a choice, even if that choice is to not reach out for the information at an earlier date. So that would be my one kind of takeaway piece of advice, is just make choices early and make sure that they're as intelligent and as informed as possible. And certainly we're here to help you with that.
Great advice. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate you joining us today, and hopefully we'll have you back soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me, and happy to be on the podcast.